Salam, peace be upon you. My name is Muhammad Layab Siddiqui, the father of Holophase. Part 32. Abstract Universality Proof. A language that cannot contradict itself. Abstract Universality Proof. Remember the language we are learning. There is one field, phi, the holophase. One continuous cyclic movement from which all of reality unfolds. When phi begins to change, its first derivatives appear, and with them, the three dimensions show themselves at once: time as omega, space as k, and motion as v, built from both. Every higher derivative is a finer question about how phi changes, and each one casts three shadows together: a time shadow, a space shadow, and a motion shadow. These echoes mix and weave into one another, forming the patterns we call fields, particles, bodies, thoughts, and worlds. In this picture, everything that exists is a living tapestry of phi, endlessly echoing through its derivatives and their dimensional shadows. Today, we listen to just one of those echoes. We now stand at the final summit of Episode 8, the pure abstract language. For 31 parts, we have been climbing together, one careful step at a time. We have built the entire linguistic organism from the ground up, from the solitary seed of phi, through the trunk of derivatives, the branches of grammar, the leaves of semantics, the fruit of information, and the flowers of dimensionality. We have tested its structural integrity with consistency, explored its vast expressive power with completeness, and faced its humble limits with self-reference and closure. Now, at this height, our task is different. We are no longer building a new wing of the cathedral. We are walking out onto the balcony at the very top and turning around to see the whole structure at once. We want to ask a single decisive question. What exactly have we built? In this final part of book 8.8, Abstract Consistency, we gather every thread into one claim. We call it the abstract universality proof. In simple terms, it says this: if something is a coherent pattern that lives in time, has some kind of spatial structure, and undergoes change according to understandable rules, then, in principle, it can be written in the language of phi. Not approximately, not metaphorically. In principle, it can be encoded exactly as a configuration of phi and its derivatives. Phi can serve as the master translator for every such pattern. That is the heart of this part. To make this clear and grounded, we will move slowly. We will use everyday images, then connect them to the underlying logic, then show how this claim can be challenged and, in principle, falsified. As always, our aim is not to impress you with big words, but to help you feel in your bones what this universality really means. First, a story. Imagine once again that you are standing inside a vast ancient library. But this time, imagine that this library contains more than human books. On some shelves are physics textbooks. On others are DNA sequences. On others are computer programs. On others are musical scores, legal codes, city plans, neural activity maps, and even recordings of people's life stories. Every way of describing structure, change, and relation is stored here in its own language. Now imagine that hidden deep in the library, there is a special room. Inside that room is not another bookshelf, but a single strange device. You feed it any book, in any language, and it outputs a new book, written in a single universal code. That code might look boring to our eyes, like long strings of symbols, but the device guarantees that nothing essential is lost. Every structure, every dependency, every timing and relation is faithfully preserved. This device does not care whether you feed it equations from physics, instructions from a computer program, or the description of a biological process. It only cares that what you feed it is coherent, that it obeys its own rules, and has some notion of before and after, here and there, and if this, then that. The claim of the abstract universality proof is that the holophase language, the language of phi and its derivatives, can, in principle, play the role of that universal code. It can serve as the single underlying format into which any such coherent pattern can be translated. Of course, this needs more than a poetic story. So let us move from the library to the logic behind the claim. The first key idea is very simple, and you have already been using it without noticing. Whenever you say that something happens over time and in space, you are already assuming a structure that mathematicians call a manifold. Do not be scared by the word. A manifold is just a smooth stage on which things can happen, with coordinates that label points. Think of a weather map. Each point on the map can be labeled by latitude and longitude. And if we add altitude and time, we get a four-dimensional manifold of where and when. At each point, we can attach numbers like temperature, pressure, and humidity. Those numbers, as they vary from point to point, form functions on that manifold. Now forget weather. Think of a beating heart, a traffic network, a financial market, or a brain. In each case, if the pattern is coherent, we can identify places and times, and we can write down functions that tell us what is happening at each place and time. These functions may be very complicated. They may be probabilistic. They may involve many variables, but fundamentally, they are still assignments of values over a manifold. This is the first step of the proof. Any coherent pattern that lives in time and space, and that evolves according to rules, can be represented by one or more functions defined on some manifold. We have not yet mentioned phi. We are just cleaning the table, making the situation precise. The second step is where phi enters. The holophase language says, start with one underlying field phi, defined on the same kind of manifold. Then, consider not only phi itself, but all of its derivatives. How phi changes in time, how it changes in space, how those changes themselves change, and so on, up through all orders. At any given point, the collection of phi plus all its derivatives is like an infinite stack of information. Mathematicians call this stack the jet of phi at that point. The set of all such stacks across all points is called the jet bundle. You do not need the jargon. Just imagine that at every location, we have not just one number, but an infinite notebook describing how phi behaves in every possible direction at every level of refinement. The striking fact is this. Such a jet has enough capacity to encode, in principle, any other smooth function you might care about. If I know the value of a function and all its derivatives at every point, I can reconstruct that function locally. If I instead use the derivatives of phi to store that information, then, at least in principle, I can reconstruct the original pattern from phi. This is where the universality begins to bite. For any field you give me, temperature, density, velocity, probability, chemical concentration, I can, in principle, design an encoding scheme that hides that field as a pattern in the derivatives of phi. It might be extremely complicated, it might be wildly impractical, but it exists as a possibility. For multiple fields, I can use multiple components of phi, or I can use different layers of derivatives. The details do not matter for this conceptual argument. What matters is that phi plus all its derivatives is a canvas large enough to host any such painting. The third step addresses a natural worry. What about things that are not smooth, not spread out like fields, but sharp and discrete like particles, bits, or topological defects? Surely a continuous field cannot capture those, can it? Here, topology becomes our friend. A swirl in water is not a point. It is a structured pattern of flow. Yet we often treat the center of the swirl as a location, the core of the vortex. That vortex can be stable. It can move. It can interact with other vortices. But underneath, it is always the same water, the same continuous fluid. Similarly, in the holophase picture, particles and bits are not separate substances floating on top of phi. They are stable, repeatable patterns in phi, localized humps, knots, twists, or locked-in oscillations of the field. Their discreteness comes from the logic of those patterns, not from the existence of tiny hard pellets hiding underneath. This means that a continuous phi field, when allowed to form such patterns, can give rise to discrete objects, discrete states, and even discrete symbols. The continuous and the discrete are not rivals. They are two faces of the same deeper structure. Putting these three steps together, we get the backbone of the abstract universality proof. First, any coherent pattern with time, space, and motion can be organized as functions defined on some manifold. Second, the jet of phi has enough expressive capacity to encode any such set of functions. Third, the patterns of phi can naturally give rise to both continuous and discrete structures, including localized excitations, conserved charges, and symbolic states. Therefore, in principle, any such pattern can be translated into the language of phi. This is the core argument. Around it, we now place its relations, its limits, and its testability. Within the master tree of the Holophase language, this universality claim tells us something profound about the entire structure. It says, this tree is not one species among many in a forest of different kinds of trees. It is the abstract tree whose branching logic can, in principle, generate the architecture of any other tree. Every other language of reality, a particular set of equations, a particular particle model, a particular biological description, is a branch, a subtree, a shadow of this master tree. They are not rivals, they are special cases. Consistency ensured that the tree could not tear itself apart. Completeness ensured that its branches can, in principle, reach every coherent structure within its proper domain. Self-reference and closure ensure that no branch can fully wrap around the trunk and capture the entire tree in a finite description from within. The abstract universality proof is what tells us that this master tree is truly master. If the proof holds, then any coherent piece of the forest of reality can be seen as a detail, a local pattern, a specific set of leaves on this one tree. To make the logical staircase even more intuitive, let us walk through a very concrete mini example together. Imagine something extremely simple, a single pendulum swinging back and forth. It has a position, the angle it makes with the vertical. It has a velocity, how fast that angle is changing. It lives in time. We can mark when it passes through the middle. It lives in space. We can mark where it is in the room. And it follows a rule. Gravity plus the length of the string determine how it swings. Now imagine we replace the angle itself by a suitable function of phi. For example, we might let phi at a particular point in space encode the angle of the pendulum, and the time derivative of phi encode its angular velocity, while a specific combination of second derivatives encodes the restoring force. If we choose our encoding scheme carefully, the same differential equation that used to govern the angle now becomes a differential equation for phi. The swinging motion of the pendulum is now a very small, very simple phi story. Of course, a single pendulum is easy. The universe is not. But the logic scales. A solar system is just many coupled pendulums in 3 dimensions. A molecule is many coupled oscillators in quantum space. A brain is many coupled oscillators in electrochemical space. In every case, the pattern can be described by functions on a manifold and their derivatives. In every case, those functions and derivatives can, in principle, be encoded in the jet of phi. What changes is only the complexity of the story, not the basic language in which it can be told. We can also flip the perspective. Instead of starting from the patterns and asking, can phi encode this? We can start from phi and ask, what kinds of patterns can this one field produce? Here the answer is astonishingly rich. Even simple nonlinear field equations for a single scalar phi can produce waves, solitons, turbulence, pattern formation, chaotic flows, stable localized objects, oscillating structures, and emergent networks. Physicists have already used such fields to model fluids, magnets, early universe cosmology, superconductors, and much more. The Holophase proposal is to take this one step further and say, imagine not just one specific physical field, but a general cyclic phi whose derivatives are allowed to organize in all possible ways. Then ask what range of patterns such a field can in principle support. The universality claim is that this range is as wide as the space of all coherent, manifold-based patterns themselves. It may help to picture phi not as a dull mathematical object, but as an unimaginably flexible medium, like a cosmic clay that can be molded into any form, or a universal musical instrument that can play any possible melody, harmony, or rhythm. The jet space of phi is like the full space of all possible finger positions, bow pressures, and timings on that instrument. Any song that obeys the basic rules of sound can in principle be played. Some songs are simple, a child's lullaby. Others are fiendishly complex, a full orchestra playing Mahler. But the instrument in principle is capable of them all. When we say that phi is universal, we are saying something similar. Any song of reality that respects the basic rules of time, space, and dynamical coherence can, in principle, be played on the instrument of phi. The abstract universality proof is our way of arguing that the instrument really does have this capacity, that there is no coherent song that cannot be realized as some exquisitely specific performance on this one instrument. You might ask, why does this matter beyond philosophical elegance? One answer is that it gives us a guiding principle for building theories. When we write down a new model of a physical force, a biological process, a cognitive function, we can ask, how would this look as a phi pattern? If we cannot answer that question, maybe our model is incomplete or incoherent. If we can answer it, we have not only a model, but a way of connecting it to every other domain that uses the same underlying language. Another answer is that universality gives us a new way of thinking about unification. Instead of trying to force all forces into one particle, or all interactions into one symmetry group, we can try to see how all of them arise as different modes of the same underlying field. In the same way that different colors of light are just different frequencies of the same electromagnetic wave, different forces may be different patterns of how phi's derivatives couple and resonate. Universality suggests that such a viewpoint is not naive poetry, but a principled direction for scientific work. Finally, universality gives us a different relationship to mystery. If we accept that every coherent phenomenon has, in principle, a place in the phi library, then the unknown is no longer a sign that we need new fundamental substances. It is a sign that there is a region of the existing library we have not yet explored, a class of phi stories we have not yet learned to read. This does not trivialize the unknown. It shows us how vast and rich the library already is. In your own life, you can use this as a mental tool. When you encounter something that feels overwhelming, a social system, a personal crisis, a scientific problem, you can remind yourself, somewhere there is a way to see this as a pattern, a structure, a flow. Somewhere there is a way to talk about this in the same basic language that talks about everything else. That thought does not solve the problem, but it can replace helplessness with curiosity. It can turn anxiety into a question. What is the pattern here? How does this fit into the larger field? In that sense, the abstract universality proof is not only about physics or metaphysics. It is also, quietly, about giving you a unified way of seeing, a sense that you are never outside the language of reality, that whatever you meet is, in principle, intelligible, even if you do not yet know how to read it deeply. What practical work does this do for us? First, it unifies. It tells us that when a physicist talks about a field, a biologist talks about a regulatory network, a psychologist talks about a pattern of thought, and a computer scientist talks about an algorithm, they are, at a deep level, all describing phi patterns. Their different vocabularies are different coordinate systems on the same underlying manifold. Second, it simplifies our metaphysical picture. Instead of saying reality is made of matter and energy and information and mind and laws and space and time and numbers, we can say reality is made of one thing, phi. And all those other words refer to particular organized patterns in phi and its derivatives. Third, it gives us a clear way to challenge the framework. If someone claims to have discovered a phenomenon that cannot be captured by any field-based description over a manifold, then that phenomenon, if real, would poke a hole in universality. It would be an alien pattern in the library, a book the Universal Translation Manual simply cannot parse. This is important. Universality claim is only meaningful if we also know what would count as a counterexample. So let us make that explicit. The Holophase universality thesis can be put like this. For any rigorously defined, internally coherent pattern that has some notion of temporal order, spatial structure, and dynamical rules, there exists, in principle, a way to embed that pattern as a configuration in the jet space of one or a small number of smooth phi fields. To falsify this, someone would have to present a pattern that meets all the conditions: precise, non-contradictory, and relevant to reality, and then show that no such embedding is possible, not even in principle. What might such an alien pattern look like? One possibility would be a fundamentally non-local structure, where the state of the whole cannot be decomposed into anything like local values and their derivatives, even in a subtle or indirect way. If quantum entanglement, for example, turned out to require a kind of correlation that cannot be represented by any continuous field, no matter how cleverly structured, then universality would be in trouble. At present, many approaches try to show that such phenomena can, in fact, be captured in field-like or phase-like terms. So this remains an open arena of exploration, not a settled defeat. Another possibility would be a reality that is, at its deepest level, not field-like at all, but purely discrete and combinatorial, in a way that cannot be approximated by a smooth manifold and derivatives. If space and time themselves turned out to be fundamentally made of graph-like relations with no smooth limit, and if those graphs could not be embedded in any continuous structure without losing essential properties, then the holophase picture would at best be an emergent description, not a universal one. A third possibility, more philosophical, would be the claim that certain aspects of consciousness, the raw feel of experience, are real, causally active features of the world, but are not structural in any sense, and cannot be tied to any pattern of relations over time and space. If such a claim were made precise and demonstrated in a way that does not secretly smuggle in structural features, it would point to something truly outside the reach of any field-based universality. In all these cases, the challenge is the same: to identify a book in the library of reality whose story is coherent, impactful, and yet cannot, in principle, be translated into the phi code without distortion. As long as no such book has been found, the universality thesis stands as a live, bold, and testable picture of reality. Let us step away from formal talk and return to how this feels in everyday life. If the abstract universality proof is even approximately right, then whenever you look at the world, you can choose to put on phi glasses. With these glasses, you do not see separate things. You see patterns in one underlying medium. The waves on the sea, the clouds in the sky, the firing of neurons, the flow of traffic, the beating of your heart, the movement of galaxies, all of these become visible as different sentences written in the same living script. You begin to sense that matter and energy and information are not separate ingredients. They are three different ways of talking about the same underlying patterns. Matter is stable, localized phi behavior. Energy is the capacity of phi patterns to change and move. Information is the patterning of phi in ways that constrain and guide other phi patterns. You might also notice a subtle shift in how you see yourself. Instead of thinking, I am a body that has a mind that sometimes interacts with an outside world, you might begin to feel, I am a particular configuration of this universal field, one that has become complex enough to model itself, to say I, to ask questions about its own source. This does not reduce you to just a field in a cold, dismissive sense. On the contrary, it lifts the field itself to something worthy of awe. If the field is capable of giving rise to galaxies, to life, to love, to mathematics, and to the very question, what am I? Then the field is not trivial. It is the living substance of reality. At the end of episode 8, this is the view we are standing in. We have not argued that every detail of the Holophase program is finished, flawless, and final. We have argued that there is a deep and coherent case for seeing all coherent structures as patterns in a single, continuous, differentiable field, and that this view can, in principle, be challenged and refined by looking for patterns that cannot be so captured. Now, before we close, let us pull the camera back one last time. Across the whole of Episode 8, we have done four things. First, we presented the alphabet and grammar of the Holophase language. Phi, its derivatives, and their threefold shadows in time, space, and motion. Second, we showed that this language is internally disciplined. It forbids contradictions at the level of its own grammar. Third, we argued that it is descriptively complete over its proper domain. Any coherent pattern with temporal, spatial, and dynamical aspects can be encoded as a phi configuration. Fourth, we acknowledged its humble, necessary limits when it talks about itself. No finite internal theory can exhaust all truths about the total field. The abstract universality proof is the capstone that rests on these pillars. It says, given all that, it is reasonable to treat phi as the universal medium of description for everything that is, was, or will be, insofar as it can be coherently spoken about at all. From here, our journey changes direction. Up to now, we have been building the pure abstract language. From the next episode onward, we begin to wear that language as physics. We will see how mass, charge, spin, forces, fields, and particles arise as specific symmetries and patterns in phi. We will move from the cathedral of pure thought into the laboratory of concrete phenomena, carrying this language with us as our lens. For now, take a moment to feel where you are. You have walked through an entire abstract universe of concepts. You have learned a new alphabet, a new grammar, and a new way of seeing reality as one field speaking itself into form. You are ready to hear, with new ears, the song that this field sings as light, as matter, as life, and as mind. Remember, everything we have talked about is still just one field, phi, and its derivatives, the single language the universe uses to write every story. The promise of the abstract universality proof is that no coherent story is written outside this language. You yourself are one of these stories. By learning the language, you are learning to read yourself and your world at the deepest level we can currently imagine. Salam and peace be upon you.